The Americans were only truly hitting their stride when World War II began. After 3 years of frenetic mobilization, they emerged not simply as the most powerful expeditionary power in history, carrying out major integrated military actions in multiple theaters of operation simultaneously, but also as the only belligerent that at war's end occupied all the defeated powers. On the roads to Rome, Berlin, and Tokyo, the Americans found themselves in control of key economic, population, and logistic nodes on 3 continents and 2 ocean basins. Between Lend-Lease deals and direct amphibious assaults, they now held all meaningful launching pads for attacks between the Western and Eastern hemispheres. Combined with their massive wartime navy, the Americans had quite inadvertently become the determining factor in issues European and Asian, financial and agricultural, industrial and trade-based, cultural, and military. If there was a moment in history that a power could have made a bid for global domination, for a new Rome to arise, this was it. And if there was ever a good reason to make such a bid, it was the nuclear-tinged competition that was arising with the Soviets the day after the guns fell silent in Germany. It didn't happen. The Americans offered their wartime allies a deal. The Americans would use their navy, the only navy of size to survive the war, to patrol the global ocean and protect the commerce of all. The Americans would open their market, the only market of size to survive the war, to Allied exports so that all could export their way back to wealth. The Americans would extend a strategic blanket over all so that no friend of America need ever fear invasion again. There is just one catch. You had to pick sides in the Americans' brewing Cold War. You could be safe and rich and develop your economy and culture however you wanted, but you had to stand with, technically stand in front of, the Americans versus the Soviets. Instead of forging an empire global in scope, the Americans bribed up an alliance to contain the Soviet Union. The catch-all phrase for the pact is Bretton Woods, named after the New Hampshire ski resort where the Americans first made the pitch shortly after the Normandy invasion. It is perhaps more commonly known as the free trade era of the post-World War II period, or simply as globalization. Why, at the very edge of victory, did the Americans give away a worldful of imperial opportunities? Partly, it was a numbers game. In 1945, the American population was roughly equal to that of the combined Western European population, which was roughly equal to that of the Soviet population. Even leaving teeming East and South Asia aside, not only did the Americans lack the forces at war's end to keep the territory it held, but simple math meant that they could not muster sufficient occupation forces to make a global empire work. Partly, it was a distance contest. Even with the strength of the U.S. Navy, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans are some serious moats, and moats work both ways. The logistical costs and overreach of maintaining permanent, forward-positioned garrison systems several thousand miles over the horizon simply wasn't practical. It is difficult to occupy a country on the other side of the world if the locals don't want you there. Korea, Vietnam, Lebanon, Iraq, and Afghanistan were often more than the Americans could handle when they were managed one at a time. Imagine what it would have been like to occupy Germany and France and Italy and Korea and Vietnam and Lebanon and Iraq and Afghanistan all at once. Partly it was a map thing. The Soviet Union was a massive land-based empire that fought with huge, slow-moving armies. America's military may have been the largest of the Allies, but the United States was primarily a naval power. Duking it out with the Soviets soldier to soldier simply wasn't an option when the bulk of the American military capacity required, well, water, and wasn't designed to fight 1,000 miles from the nearest friendly port. Partly, it was a culture clash. The United States was the modern world's first democracy. Democracies are pretty good at defending their own and tearing down dictatorships and fighting for truth and justice and all that. Long-term occupations expressly designed to bleed the locals dry? That's a harder sell. Partly, it was an organizational mismatch. The United States is a federation, where the states wield as much power as the national government, for good reason. The country's safe security geography, combined with its rich economic geography, meant the federal government didn't need to do much. For the first 3 generations of U.S. history, all the federal government was perennially responsible for was building a few roads, regulating immigration, and collecting tariffs. The Americans have never had a tradition of governing excellence, a non-tradition that proudly continues to the modern day. Because for much of their history, they didn't really need a government. Managing foreign territories twice the size of the United States would have been, really hard. And the Americans are, really bad at government. If the United States couldn't, or wouldn't, forge an empire to fight the Soviets, then the Americans needed allies that were sufficiently numerous to make a difference, sufficiently proximate to the Soviet border to mitigate America's distance, sufficiently skilled in land-based warfare to compensate for America's naval and amphibious nature, sufficiently wealthy to pay for their own defense, and sufficiently motivated by their own independence to bleed for it should fighting be required. None of that would have been possible with American occupation armies on their soils and American customs officials in their boardrooms. But most of all, the Americans didn't want an empire because they already had an empire. The useful lands of the United States' portion of North America were greater in potential than that of any empire that had come before. And at war's end, the Americans not only were not yet done metabolizing them, they wouldn't be for decades. Based on population density, one could easily argue that the Americans in 2022 are still not done. Why send your sons and daughters abroad to bleed in a day-to-day fight against dozens of peoples to maintain a global empire when you could just build some new roads around Detroit and Denver and get the same payout? The American break with the traditions of international relations went beyond its abandonment of the to the winner go the spoils style of postbellum realignments. It also extended to the nature of human existence itself, resulting in a fundamental rewiring of the human condition. At war's end, the Americans used Bretton Woods to create the globalized order and fundamentally change the rules of the game. Instead of subjugating their allies and enemies, they offered peace and protection. They transformed regional geopolitics by putting nearly all the warring empires of the previous age, in many cases countries that had been in a shifting, cutthroat competition with one another for centuries, on the same team. Inter-imperial rivalry gave way to interstate cooperation. Military competition was banned among the Bretton Woods participants, enabling the former empires, and in many cases their former colonies, to focus their efforts not on armies or navies or borders, but instead on infrastructure and education and development. Instead of having to fight for food or oil, everyone gained trade access global in scope. Instead of having to fight off empires, everyone gained local autonomy and safety. Compared to the 13 millennia of history to this point, it was a pretty good deal. And it worked really well. In a mere 45 years, the Bretton Woods system succeeded in not just containing the Soviet Union, but in choking it to death. The Bretton Woods system generated the longest and deepest period of economic growth and stability in human history. Or at least it did, until disaster struck. Until the Americans won. On November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Over the course of the next few years, the Soviet Union lost control of its Central European satellites. Russia lost control of the Soviet Union, and Moscow even briefly lost control of the Russian Federation. Across the American alliance network, there were celebrations, parties, parades, good ones. But there was also a new problem. Bretton Woods was not a traditional military alliance. In order to combat the Soviets, the Americans had used their dominance of the oceans and superior economic geography to purchase an alliance. The United States enabled global trade and provided a bottomless market for alliance members' exports. Without a foe, the Bretton Woods alliance lost its reason to be. Why expect the Americans to continue paying for an alliance when the war was over? It would be like continuing to make mortgage payments even after your house is paid for. As the 1990s unfolded, the Americans somewhat lazily segued into an amorphous middle area. They would continue to uphold the order so long as the Europeans and Japanese granted them deference in regional defense planning. Given that the Soviet Union was gone, the Russians were in disarray, and the Islamic world was more or less quiet, the cost to the Europeans seemed low and the benefits high. The biggest issue the NATO alliance faced was the disintegration of Yugoslavia, a rather esoteric event whose spillover didn't threaten the security of a single NATO country. The hottest event in the Middle East was the occasional pop of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. In Asia, China may have been rising with the unwinding of the Mao cult, but to think of China as a serious military power was borderline laughable. In such a benign environment, no one thought much about rocking the proverbial boat. The 1990s were a nice decade for most. Strong American-provided security. No serious international conflicts. Global trade penetrated deep into the former Soviet space, as well as into the countries that had done their best to sit out the Cold War. The cost of the American overwatch and market access steadily expanded, but in an environment of peace and prosperity, it all seemed manageable. Germany reunified. Europe reunified. The Asian tigers roared. China came into its own, driving down the price of consumer products. Resource producers, whether in Africa, Latin America, or down under, made scads of money helping more parts of the world industrialize. Globe-spanning supply chains made the digital revolution not simply possible, but inevitable. Good times. We all came to think of it as normal. It is not. The post-Cold War era is possible only because of a lingering American commitment to a security paradigm that suspends geopolitical competition and subsidizes the global order. With the Cold War security environment changed, it is a policy that no longer matches needs. What we all think of as normal is actually the most distorted moment in human history. That makes it incredibly fragile. And it is over.